All right, everyone, welcome back to the Kyle Anslone Show. We have another huge episode for everyone today. A really big question we're going to get into, which is how much longer can the Ukrainians continue to fight? And we have statements from both the Russian and the Ukrainian perspective on this, and actually they align quite a bit. So let's first listen to what Vladimir Putin has to say on what he thinks the timeline is going to be for the war in Ukraine.
Without the Western sponsors, they won't last. It will all be over in 1.5 or 2 months. In this regard, Ukraine's sovereignty, it almost lost its sovereignty altogether. So if Ukraine's Western sponsors want peace, it is quite straightforward, as I've been telling, including to the Biden administration. They can find a legal pathway.
So it's very interesting there that Putin is saying that they have about a month and a half or 2 months. And of course, he's saying if they lose the Western assistance, that's how much longer they could keep fighting. But he's making this point into discussion about negotiations and how Ukraine needs to come to the table and negotiate with Russia now, or the country risks losing its sovereignty. Now, in a lot of ways, the Ukrainians have lost their sovereignty to the West. Ukraine and Kiev as a government exists solely because the West funds it. We saw in recent days after the Trump administration ordered USAID to end its funding programs, multiple Ukrainian websites lost so much funding that they had to immediately start donation drives to beg readers to give them money to keep their websites up and running. And so Ukraine is desperately in need of Washington aid. And it's not just for the military, it's for all aspects of their government. And so Putin is letting the Ukrainians know that if they want to negotiate, if they want to come to the table, they need to do it soon. Because if you've essentially lost your sovereignty to the West, and you only have a short period of time that your forces could keep fighting, and obviously that they could keep funding their government in general. Now, that is from the Russian side. And Putin, I think, throughout the war has probably been a little bit optimistic on how close the Ukrainians were to defeat. Prior to the invasion, he talked about Russia's ability to be in Kiev in 2 weeks if it came down to it. And since this war has gone on for 3 years now, obviously that's not quite the case. However, the Ukrainians are not predicting a good outcome for Kiev. So this is an article from antiwar.com. Ukrainian military chief warns of threat to Ukraine's existence if negotiations with Russia don't start. So the head of Ukraine's military intelligence has warned if there's no serious negotiations by the summer, dangerous processes could unfold, threatening Ukraine's very existence. And I'm sure that those dangerous processes that he is talking about is the complete collapse of the Ukrainian military. At least right now, the Ukrainians they're losing territory. They're losing key cities in the Donbass. The fighting is not going well for Ukraine. However, they do still have frontline positions. If the Russians want to take more territory, it's going to have to come going through Ukrainians, which means losses on the Russian side too. And so Ukraine still will have standing at the negotiating table to talk with Russia, to try to bargain, to try to maybe get some concessions, maybe get some of their territory back from the Kremlin. However, if they wait till there's a complete collapse of the Ukrainian army and there's nothing standing between Russian forces and Kiev or any Ukrainian city, then the Ukrainians will just have to negotiate at the barrel of the Russian gun and concede to whatever the Russians want. And so he is warning that Ukraine is risking the existence of the state. They're risking their sovereignty by continuing this fighting. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem that even the current White House is in as much of a hurry as maybe the Ukrainians need to be to actually get the negotiations done. Trump is talking about 100 days from now. And I mean, before he was elected, he was talking about, he would have a deal done in 24 hours. And so he's already kicked the can down the road 100 days. But more concerning, the Trump administration hasn't put forward a reasonable proposal to Ukraine. On the last episode of the show, I talked about and noted how Trump have been talking to and about China with some level of respect. He's talking about how he could get along with the Chinese president, and he's not just outwardly making threat after threat after threat. But that's not what he's doing with Russia. He'll say some kind things about Putin, but we saw on Truth Social, he's saying that if the Russians don't enter negotiations, he's going to put on sanctions, taxes, tariffs on Russian imports. And look, Russia isn't in a position right now where they're going to have to make a lot of concessions at the negotiating table because of their upper hand on the battlefield. And so the Trump administration, if they're going to get a deal done with the Russians, if they're going to help to make sure that one day there will still be a sovereign Ukraine, that Ukraine doesn't lose more key cities. I mean, what if they lose Odessa and their access to the Black Sea? I think these are real threats that Kiev would face if they have to negotiate, as I said, at the barrel of the Russian gun, because their army has completely collapsed. And so if the US is going to help Ukraine by negotiating today, one of the things we need to be doing is not making these threats to the Russians and start to put forward reasonable proposals to the Russians, letting Moscow know that Washington is willing to compromise and say that Ukraine not only will not join NATO for 20 years, but will never join the North Atlantic Alliance, that they're not going to continue to get these ATACMS and other long-range NATO missiles that they're using to launch attacks deep into Russian territory. We saw, in fact, just last night, Tuesday night, the Russian Defense Ministry reported that there were over 100 Ukrainian drones launched into Russian territory. And one of those drones is reported to have been targeting a Russian nuclear power plant. Now, we shouldn't be surprised by this because Ukraine throughout the war has been stepping up attacks inside Russia and particularly on Russian energy infrastructure. Earlier this month, during Ukraine's largest missile and drone barrage on Russia since the start of the war, one of the things they targeted is a hub for the Turk Stream pipeline, which is the last gas pipeline that's bringing natural gas from Russia into Europe. It goes from Russia under the Baltic Black Sea and then into Turkey. And so this pipeline is key, and Ukraine is trying to decimate the Russian energy infrastructure. This is a real problem. This is a real concern, and something that we is going to increase tensions between Moscow and the U.S. In recent months, the New York Times has reported twice on the U.S. helping Ukraine to develop its own domestic drone industry, including by giving $800 million to Kiev to develop long-range drones. Then later this year, or actually earlier this month, the New York Times reported that they had given Ukraine $1.5 billion to develop the domestic drone industry in Ukraine. And again, these drones are being used to attack Russian nuclear power plants, Russian pipelines. Moscow is going to continue to respond to this, as Putin explained in December. If any attack comes on Russia, it's going to come back tenfold on the attacker. And so every single time Ukraine does this, and they do with Western backing, Russia responds by pummeling Ukrainian cities more and more and more, destroying more infrastructure, leading to longer blackouts, more cold nights for the Ukrainian people. Now, Trump really could do an important and a good deal here. He could probably get Ukrainians a pretty solid deal. Now, it's not going to be as good, unfortunately, as what the Ukrainians had on the table in February 2022, where Russia was allowing Ukraine to keep the Donbass, to keep the southern oblast of Zaporizhia and Kherson. They're now going to have to give those up. However, maybe other concessions, the U.S. could talk about actually a wider security agreement with Russia concerning all of Europe. So closing the door to NATO expansion entirely. 32 members of the alliance is enough. We have the Aegis Ashore missile systems in Poland and Romania. And to Russia, these present a core and critical attack on their national security, because these missile systems are capable of firing Tomahawk missiles. And so the U.S. could theoretically then put a nuclear-capable missile in Poland or Romania that could hit Moscow in a matter of minutes. This is an absolute nightmare for the Kremlin, and they would love to have these systems out of Eastern Europe. And so if the Biden administration was more willing to negotiate, then I think it would be real possible to get something done. Now, Before we jump ahead to talking about UNRWA, there was this interesting tweet that Thomas Massey had put out, and it was actually originally from Mike Lee just saying, who wants to get out of NATO? And Thomas Massey, of course, was very enthusiastically supporting that. So I think it's great that this discussion is coming up in Washington. And hopefully it picks up some momentum. Unfortunately, right now it's one senator, one representative voicing that opinion. So now let's move on and talk about UNRWA. This is the Palestinian Aid Agency, the refugee agency that was formed after the creation of Israel in the Nakba back in, I believe, 1949. It was founded and has since provided jobs and different kinds of aid and assistance to Palestinians that live either in Israel, the occupied territories of Gaza and the West Bank, also in Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, where they live as refugees. But particularly since the start of the Israeli onslaught in Gaza, UNRWA has been key, maybe the most important aid agency in bringing food to the Palestinian people day after day after day as they face famine. When we talk about 71 aid trucks a day getting into Gaza during the month of December, most of those trucks are at least coordinated going to UNRWA sites and being distributed by UNRWA. And so now Israel is taking aim at that organization. So let's listen to what the Israeli ambassador to the UN had to say about UNRWA.
I hereby inform the United Nations and the Security Council that the legislation concerning UNRWA's activities in Israel will officially come into force in 48 hours on January 30. In accordance with applicable Israeli law and following the termination of the provisional agreement, UNRWA must cease its operations and evacuate all premises it operates in Jerusalem, including the properties located in Ma'alot Dafna and Kfar Akeb. The legislation forbids UNRWA from operating within the sovereign territory of the State of Israel and forbids any contact between Israeli officials and UNRWA. Furthermore, UNRWA will be prohibited from maintaining any representative, office, service, or activity within our territory. Israel will terminate all collaboration, communication, and contact with UNRWA or anyone acting on its behalf. This decision was not made lightly, nor was it made quickly. It was not a political decision. It was simply a necessary one.
So saying getting rid of UNRWA was a necessary decision just goes to show how much Israel is trying to eliminate the Palestinian people from historic Palestine. The people of Gaza are now living on piles of rubble that used to be their houses. There is no infrastructure. There's no hospitals. There's no bakeries. There's no schools for the children to go to. The people there are going to live in desperate situations. There's no pipelines bringing water into homes. There's no drinkable water. There's no sewage to take away, human waste. These are massive and major problems that the people in this region are going to face. Prior to the Israeli decimation on the Gaza Strip, before entire cities looked like heaps of rubble and demolition sites, the people of Gaza relied on 500 aid trucks, a lot of them, again, either facilitated for, distributed by UNRWA, coming into the Strip every single day. Now it's going to require much, much more than that to keep the population alive. And UNRWA is the aid organization that has the capability, that has the logistical capability, the connections, the employees, the staff on the ground, the facilities to take this aid into Gaza and distribute it to the Palestinian people. And by eliminating, by destroying UNRWA in the way that Israel is doing it now, they are making it impossible to get the aid to the people of Gaza when they need it most. Now, on top of the humanitarian crisis this is going to create, on top of what this is going to do to the Palestinian people, it's also going to have another really negative effect. And that is, it could very well kill the ceasefire agreement, the hostage exchange going on right now between Hamas and Israel. So this is an article that I wrote for the Libertarian Institute. UNRWA shutdown risks killing Gaza ceasefire. And the UNRWA chief Felipe Larenzare responded to the shuttering of UNRWA in Israel and saying it risked causing the Gaza ceasefire and hostage deal to end. He explained to the UN Security Council, in 2 days, our operations in the occupied Palestinian territories will be crippled as legislation passed by the Israeli Knesset takes effect. At stake is the fate of millions of Palestinians, the ceasefire, the prospects for a political solution that brings lasting peace and security. And so this is, again, really important point that Laranzar is making here about the ceasefire. A key piece of this ceasefire is that Israel is supposed to allow 800 aid trucks into Gaza every single day. If UNRWA is shut down, the ability to take in and distribute and maybe even bring that aid into Gaza every day is severely diminished. And so this could be a real blow or even cause the ceasefire to collapse entirely. Additionally, he's explaining that this could really lose the support of the Palestinian population of Gaza and their support for the ceasefire, which is probably going to be key if this is going to be seen all the way through to the end. Remember, this is supposed to be more than a 42-day pause where we see 33 Israelis exchange for a few hundred or maybe 1,000 Palestinian detainees in Israel, but rather it's supposed to be the first part of a 3-phase deal that eventually not only sees a permanent end to the conflict, but a rebuilding of the Gaza Strip. And so if you don't have the Palestinian buy-in on this from the civilian population, it's simply not going to work. And as he's explaining, eliminating UNRWA is going to do that. Now, he goes on to say and make this other very important point, which is he told the Security Council that Israel ramped up its global propaganda campaign against the aid agency. He explained the government of Israel is investing significant resources to portray the agency as a terrorist organization, and our staff as terrorists are terrorist sympathizers. Billboards and ads accusing UNRWA of terrorism recently appeared in major cities around the world. They were paid for by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. The UNRWA chief went on to say that Tel Aviv is weaponizing Google ads as a part of its narrative warfare. Google ads campaigns redirect those seeking information about the agency to websites replete with disinformation. And so again, this is a really important point and something that Israel has been doing really since October 7th. Because remember, on October 7th, then Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, who's now a wanted war criminal from the International Criminal Court, pledged, not only told his troops to treat the Palestinians as human animals, but pledged to do everything he can to prevent any aid from getting into the people of Gaza. Energy, water, food, medicine. They were going to cancel everything. And UNRWA was the one aid agency that was really able to get past the Israeli blockade, bring the aid into the people, get through the Israeli checkpoints, and have some level of help to the Palestinian people. And so Israel immediately took aim at the agency and started this smear campaign against them. And so initially they claimed 13 members of UNRWA had participated in the October 7th attack, and then passed out a dossier to various media outlets around the world who all looked at what Israel gave them. And this isn't, just what the Libertarian Institute reported, although I did write it up at the time, but this was from mainstream outlets. France 24, BBC, BuzzFeed, the Daily Beast were all reporting that Israel's dossier claiming that UNRWA had participated in the attack presented no evidence whatsoever. And in fact, after a UN inquiry headed by a former French foreign minister, also found that Israel wasn't able to prove any links between Hamas and UNRWA. And so not only is the claim that they participated in the October 7th attack, but the claim that there's any connection at all between this aid agency and the Hamas militant group was simply unfounded. And so at the same time, though, this Israeli propaganda, even if it wasn't true, it was effective. A number of countries, a couple dozen Western countries, all cut their funding to UNRWA, including the United States, which is UNRWA's biggest funder. And so this is a major development. That was a major propaganda win for Israel to claim that UNRWA was tied to this terrorist organization, or was labeled by the West as a terrorist organization, and able to get their funding dramatically cut. Now, to kind of continue with this, Israel's also killing a lot of the UNRWA staff, and this again is a major thing, right? These are the people that are distributing the aid in the Gaza Strip. These are the people helping make sure the children have food, and maybe there's like some classrooms set up in the shelters or in the tent camps. These are things that are being done through UNRWA, and 273 of their staff have been killed throughout this conflict. That's the largest number of staff members, of UN staffers killed in a conflict in history. And so, again, this is a major propaganda point by Israel that's had real impacts on the ground. So next up, I do want to get to where the Israeli intelligence supposedly came from, that Hamas was tied with UNRWA. And this is an article that I wrote for the antiwar.com a few months ago titled UN Alleges Israel tortured staff to generate Hamas intel. And so Reuters reported that that reviewed an 11-page UN investigation into claims that UNRWA had substantial ties with Hamas. And it said agency staff members have been subject to threats and coercion by the Israeli authorities while in detention and pressured to make false statements against the agency, including that the agency had affiliations with Hamas and that UNRWA staff members took part in the October 7, 2023 atrocities. The investigation concluded the coercion included severe physical beatings, waterboarding, and threats to harm family members, including according to the outlet. And so this is full-on torture, right? We're talking about waterboarding, the most cruel things that the Bush administration was doing during the CIA torture and rendition program to detainees. The Israelis are doing this to UN staff members to generate false confessions against the agency so they could allow less and less aid to reach the people of Gaza. This is absolutely atrocious and disgusting. And of course, when this came out, the U.S. should have immediately cut our military funding to Israel. After all, since October 7th, 2023, the U.S. has given Israel over $22 billion in military assistance, not to mention our, deploying the THAAD missile systems to Israel to prevent them from being attacked by Iran, helping to provide the military equipment for Israel to attack Iran, facilitating the downfall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, helping Israel clear out southern Lebanon of Hezbollah, and also the war the U.S. is waging against the Houthis in Yemen. All this U.S. support that we're giving Israel is being used to make the people of Gaza as impoverished, as desperate, in famine conditions, on the brink of starvation. And I guess, as we've heard Israeli officials say time and time again throughout the conflict, the goal is to get the Palestinian people of Gaza to what they call voluntarily emigrate out of the Gaza Strip, which basically means that you will either starve to death trying to cling to your homeland of Palestine, or you will be transferred to Egypt, Jordan, or another country that the U.S. and Israel are able to bribe into taking the Palestinians and being a part of this genocide. And so this war against UNRWA is a really big deal. Not only does it threaten the ceasefire, but more importantly, it threatens the livelihood of the people of Gaza. The little bit of aid that they need to cling to survival could be stripped away with them because of this war. And then again, the propaganda campaign against UNRWA allows for Israel to kill hundreds of Palestinian UN staffers living in Gaza, 273 of them. And for the Western press to just dismiss it as, oh, they're UNRWA staff, they're tied to a terrorist organization. We also saw the UNRWA headquarters flattened. We actually have a tweet of this, and so you guys can see the picture of just their headquarters. Their headquarter building in Gaza was flattened by Israel, was bombed, destroyed by Israel. That's how little Israel cares about that aid agency, how much they want to destroy that aid agency. All right, everybody, that is the show I have for y'all today. Really, thank you all so much for tuning in. This is by far the largest live audience that we've had. We have really big numbers. So if you could take the time to go to the YouTube channel and subscribe to the show, I do really appreciate when you could do that. It helps us get the channel monetized. And then we're going to be back with more and more content for you all. And again, if you're just listening on Twitter, share out the show, like the show. All that does help us. And we'll be back with another episode of the Kyle Anselon Show soon.